God gave Adam and Eve a garden, and Mohammed promised all gardeners a passport to heaven. Godliness and gardening have often gone together. Growing things calls forth the priest and poet in all of us, though earthly gardens have been created for every kind of reason. The banker who built these classical temples in 18th century England was moved by fashion and art, rather than a need to placate the spirits of the place to ensure a good harvest. Yet, in the beginning, all gardens spring from our basic need to survive by growing food. Such basic cultivation can still be seen in many parts of the world, as here in the mountains of Chiapas in southern Mexico. Each year, this man and his family clear the ground around their home for the planting of crops, which need special care and attention. It is one of the oldest rituals of living once people decided to settle down. These Indians, descendants of the Maya, use all the natural resources they can grow. The woman is spinning thread from flax. The house itself is organic and can be extended as the family grows. It's built of sticks, straw, and earth. The garden patch just outside the door is for food. Any flowering plants are only part of the growing cycle, as here on these bean vines. Yet at some remote time, flowers came to be appreciated for themselves and were gathered to decorate the house and shrine. Instead of haphazard picking of wild plants, gardening meant that man had decided to stay put, start a family, wall himself in. It is the beginning of our communities and cities. Around his house, he kept his most valuable possessions, his turkeys, chickens, and children. But beyond the domestic order of his planting lay the disorder and threat of the wilderness. Gradually, the first farmer gardeners learned to give special care to the sources of food. In Mexico, corn. Because of the construction of the ear of corn with its protective husks, it cannot seed itself. It would become extinct if we ceased to take a hand and unwrap the cob and seeds from their confining leaves. Not far from this spot, some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, man discovered that by careful selection of the seed, the puny ancestor of corn could be increased in size many-fold. Over the centuries, it has developed into a mighty stalk with a crop that could feed a continent. The seeds are carefully sorted, the ground cleansed with fire, and the planting completed with a stick and a flick of the hand, a gesture repeated for thousands of years. By this collaboration and the startling results, corn itself took on a spiritual quality, holding secrets of both life and death. In this community, shamans are still called on to make predictions on health, harvest, and other human affairs. The sacred book of the Maya declared that man is made from corn. So the shaman uses corn seeds in deciding man's fate. This boy had a serious cough. Cast into the holy water, the movement of the kernels will reveal what kind of treatment the boy will need. The Maya were converted to Christianity centuries ago, but the festivals of the church are integrated with more ancient celebrations of planting, cultivation, and harvesting. They relate the people directly to the fields and gardens in the mountain highlands. So decorated Christian crosses are transformed into trees of life. At the summer solstice, the whole community gathers in the ceremonial center of San Juan Chamula. They are coming to celebrate the longest day of the year, an acknowledgement of the power of their ancient Maya deity, the sun. Christian symbols mingle with these dancing figures, nature spirits that survived from before the Spanish conquest. These men and women are not only beseeching God for his gifts of sun and rain, they are celebrating the vitality that unites them with the elements in an exchange of energy that is life itself. The tradition of gardening in Japan also preserves a respect for the rhythm of the seasons, a respect that is rooted in ancient agriculture. Rice, like corn, requires man's intervention to grow. This concentration of effort may well have carried over into the making of Japanese gardens. Rice is a tyrant. Each plant has to be cultivated individually. Even though machines have largely taken over this work, the Japanese still respect the laws of nature and the role it has played in its culture. These rice fields are in the grounds of an imperial villa in Kyoto. The idea of the ruler as high priest and gardener is as old as recorded history. Each year, the Emperor of Japan steps into a paddy field to plant rice to ensure a bountiful crop for the nation. It has been said by Japanese to be his most important ritual duty. The first gardens of Japan may well have been groves of tall trees like these, where the spirits of nature could feel at home. Niwa, the Japanese word for garden, means a comfortable place to live together with the gods in an earthly setting. And who could doubt that the gods of nature have found the perfect home here at the Shinto shrine of Ise? Each morning, the priests at Ise make a traditional breakfast offering to the god of nature. Fish, fruit, vegetables, and rice bring to the god the produce of this holy place. Trees, gravel spaces, rocks, even the fish have a sacred role to play. The story goes that Amaterasu, the sun goddess, came down to stay on Earth. She was attracted by the trees, hills, and river. Pilgrims still wash in the purifying waters. So gardens are once again linked to the founding of a faith, a familiar theme in the world's great religions. This grove of cryptomeria trees has stood in front of the great shrine at Ise for over 700 years. Many thousands come each year to petition for divine help. In front of this most sacred space, a clap of the hands will get the god's attention. The presence of the deity is signified by the moving of the curtain by the wind.
الحمد لله الذي أظهر الأكوان.
It is possible to make a holy garden with only stones and water, as in this Islamic courtyard in Morocco. Here on the edge of the desert, where nature is at its stingiest, the idea of a garden can be evoked by nothing more than a cool space, water, colored tiles, and the words from the Quran declaring heaven a garden for the faithful. Muhammad described paradise as a place of green pastures, fountains of gushing water, fruit, palm trees, and pomegranates. Cornucopia of stone fruit often decorate Christian churches, a reminder of the lost Garden of Eden. Behind this facade, decorated with Indian corn, lies one of the first Christian monasteries built in the New World. This great fortress church was begun by the Spaniards within 20 years of their conquest of Mexico. Indian workmen have put Spanish skulls on the cross. The arms blossom into native flowers. This sheltered cloister is the oldest surviving garden in the Western Hemisphere. The secluded garden could soothe the soul and help to banish the ills of the body through the medicinal herbs grown there. Some, like the acanthus plant, were brought all the way from Europe. Nature has been perfected to suit a particular time, place, and human need, whether it be for a quiet cloister or the garden of a palace. Renaissance Europe, like Shakespeare, believed that all the world was a stage. It was a useful metaphor that quickly found expression in the splendid gardens of Italy. Pope Clement VIII created a theater setting on these slopes for his great villa Aldobrandini, his summer retreat outside Rome. The garden and the landscape was a perfect stage set, a realm of myth, magic, and illusion. Behind the palace, a cast of classical figures disport themselves. Atlas and his crew of centaurs and tritons perform for the audience in the palace. As if from a box in the theater, they can look down from the top floor loggia, while on each side of the villa, splendid trees counterpoint the pattern of the formal gardens. The artist Claude Monet was looking for a more private reward when he built, largely with his own hands, his garden at Giverny in France. By diverting a local stream, he was able to create a water garden and fill it with exotic water lilies, which had only just arrived in Europe from Japan in the 1890s. Extending and perfecting his garden became the main preoccupation of his later life. And eventually it became the main subject of his art, as it has continued to be for later aspiring painters. Monet had always worked closely with nature, but now the private garden world he had created became his ideal landscape. Here he recorded its changing moods with painful care. His garden recreates each summer the mass of blooms from all over the world that he introduced into it. Here indeed is nature thoughtfully perfected according to a personal vision. But man also learned to cherish nature untrammeled in the wild. It was not until 1852 that a detachment of American cavalry first saw this hidden valley in the high Sierra Mountains of California. On June 29, 1864, President Lincoln took the first official step to protect and preserve the valley of Yosemite because, as he said, there was no other condition of things like this one on Earth. It was to be a national monument of thanksgiving for the end of the Civil War. Yosemite's garden, cultivated by glaciers, wind, and violent upheavals, would be saved to remind generations of what had been lost in the name of civilization. In wilderness, Thoreau said, is the preservation of the world. The wilderness remains a challenge to the daring and the youthful. Despite the hordes of visitors, Yosemite survives in its stunning magnificence and power, its immense variety, adaptability, and strength of renewal. Fate has preserved another kind of garden in the middle of the skyscrapers of Tokyo. In the center of this steel and concrete, the palace of the emperor is protected by green wilderness. Idealized nature has never been more concentrated or imprisoned. Today, the lawns and trees around the palace are maintained by volunteer gardeners who come from all over Japan for the privilege of tending and beautifying the imperial grounds, a custom that began when volunteers cleared bomb damage in the Second World War. The idea of working to improve the landscape has always been as irresistible to the human species as its urge to destroy. Improvement carried to extremes can also be a form of arrogance. The idea of power, and particularly official power, seems out of place in a garden. But royal power was often displayed in rich and florid grandeur. The straight central avenue of the palace of the kings of France at Versailles is the supreme example of making nature deliver the message of just who's in charge here on earth, or at least in France. The king's gardens cost a fortune to build and maintain. Their gilded version of an ideal world also helped to isolate the king and court, an isolation forcibly ended when the mob stormed Versailles at the beginning of the Revolution. Yet the gardens were spared the mob's fury, and so they serve today as a kind of national park for France. From Mountain Corn Patch to the splendors of royal parks, all gardens show in some degree the personal taste of their creators. They demonstrate one of the most innocent of human aspirations, the desire to embellish and humanize nature. And so gardens have been entwined in our story since the beginning of history.
This is PBS.
The revolutionary idea of a garden as a conscious man-made work of art appears almost as early as the first outlines of Chinese civilization 3,000 years ago. The Chinese scholar's garden, made by poets, painters, and philosophers, was never seen as one large independent space, but as a series of mysterious garden spaces to be discovered. Most plants were used for symbolic meaning. Color and decoration counted not at all. But the subtle, profound pleasure of the Chinese garden is in the ritual of discovery, exploring a perfect world contained in a network of ideal spaces. Its very austerity makes the experience more intense and human, allowing the smooth rocks and tactile wood surfaces to please the touch, and the scent of sweet-smelling plants to please the nose, their subtle colors to play on the eye. From the very beginning, the emperors of China were also great garden builders on an imperial scale. They thought of their gardens as a recreation of an ideal imperial world, magnificently symmetrical, built on elevations. They were designed, as all imperial gardens are, to impress and to awe ordinary people. These artificial lakes in Beijing were first excavated by an emperor around 400 BC. They are still a source of pleasure and awe for the teeming citizens of China today. Dragons are not here to terrify, but as guardian spirits, ensuring happiness. Too much grandeur can suffocate, as imperial courts throughout history have discovered. So the Chinese let in a few cheerful spirits in tune with the mood of the visiting crowds. In the 13th century, which by Chinese calculation is the beginning of the modern era, Marco Polo thought the imperial gardens exceeded anything he had ever seen before. Nowadays, they have a role much like Disneyland, and just as in the West, the Chinese like to come dressed in their best to be photographed in these splendid surroundings. Even the emperors like a joke, as in this stone barge forever moored to the shore. Or as in this movie set, Village Street, hidden away in the corner of the imperial summer palace. Here the emperor and court could play at shopping in these artificial streets, built along a lake, which they pretended was the Suqiao River, which was actually far to the south of China. The Chinese love of contrast, long-enduring stone, and ephemeral paper streamers and lanterns is striking. But real streets, canals, and gardens have existed in the real Suqiao for more than 2,000 years. It flourishes today as a bustling modern city. Like many of us, the Chinese artist or gentleman scholar gardener also loved the excitement of life in the city. But he also wanted a private retreat. So at an early stage, secluded gardens were created in the middle of great urban centers. These are China's greatest garden legacies to the urban world of the late 20th century. If one can find peace and stillness in the middle of a city, a 12th century writer pointed out, why would one want to look for a more distant one in the country? The ideal scholar's garden world had nothing to do with the imperial splendor of a palace and a park. It was a simple hermit's hut in a garden retreat where the painter and poet could live, work, and meditate, secluded from all worldly thoughts. To live with a feeling of remote privacy in a bustling city, first of all, requires walls. The Chinese garden is, in the end, the sanctuary of the introvert. It is walled in by walls within walls within walls. There is a bewildering lack of a unifying plan so essential to garden builders in the West. When the guest thinks he has seen everything, a turn in the path opens up a whole new vista or leads one into an entirely new garden. The experience is very much like looking at a scroll painting as it unfurls. The age-old yearning for emotional and spiritual escape from the chaos of ordinary life is perfectly captured in this Suzhou scholar's garden and this 4th century poem. I now lean on the south window and let my pride expand. I consider how easy it is to be content with little space. Every day I stroll in the garden, but the gate is always shut. The clouds aimlessly rise from the peaks. As the sun rays grow dim and disappear from view, I walk around my lonely pine tree. For all of its vast horticultural riches, 1/7 of the world's flowers and ornamental plants are actually found there. Nevertheless, flowers have a secondary role in the Chinese garden. There are no Gertrude Jekyll's and Vita Sackville Wests in Chinese garden history. European symmetry and order, and particularly a well-mown lawn, held absolutely no appeal where the complexities and movement of wild nature served as the model garden. Like an artist, the garden maker was a master of the element of the real in the illusion, and the illusion present in reality. His job was to perfect a series of intimate spaces, to talk with one or two friends, take tea, listen to music, write poetry, or just to meditate. There is no distinction between indoors and the garden. Verandas, porches, covered walks serve as links. A sea was made by digging an artificial pool. This garden house above a garden sea is called the Pavilion of the Arriving Moon and Wind, a name that celebrates the important role the poet played in the Chinese garden. Lines from poems were placed at strategic turns and corners to underline a particular mood the setting was supposed to communicate. Our imagination really soars when we are told that the Blue Waves Pavilion Garden has slowly evolved over a period of 1,000 years. Nearly 600 years before Columbus began his search for a shortcut to this mythical country. To the Chinese, gardening was always a fine art, equal to music, poetry, calligraphy, and painting. Natural mountains dominate much of the landscape of China, so mountain rocks were brought into the city garden, often created by an artist as a large sculpture, and built of the time-worn limestone selected for its exotic form and surface. Some of the best were dragged from ancient lakes and riverbeds. Rocks were often used to make mazes such as this. At the heart of Chinese philosophy, painting, and poetry was the celebration of man's profound relationship with his surroundings. Chinese metaphysics, over the centuries, had encouraged art to be slowly and subtly drawn from nature. In fact, the Chinese word for landscape is shanshu, which literally means mountain and water. And both the mountain in the form of beautiful rocks, along with water in lakes and miniature pools, were the essential garden components, the yin and yang of Chinese garden design. When the West first discovered the gardens of China in the 18th century, it was a few obvious elements, pagodas, lanterns, bridges, that announced that a garden was in fact Chinese. To the Western eye, equally essential forms of Chinese culture are the pagoda and the dramatic postures of the martial arts that are often practiced in the parks of modern China. Both forms were adopted by the neighboring island kingdom of Japan when it first established contact with China nearly 1,500 years ago. Japan had an ancient tradition and respect for nature long before the Japanese discovered China. But Chinese design had a profound impact. Buddhist priests who had studied in China played an important role in Japanese garden design and in the use of the garden as a focus of meditation rather than pleasure. Landscape paintings of China's great mountains were collected in Buddhist monasteries. This creation of miniature mountains with ornamental rocks in this 14th century Buddhist garden in Tenryuji could have come directly from Suzhou. Borrowing distant scenery and incorporating it into the intimacy of the garden was a Chinese invention, but splendidly refined in Japan. The wild nature of rocks, woods, and mountains is drawn into the fragile intimacy of the garden. A garden built around a pool is a recurring theme in Japan. The Silver Pavilion was originally built as a private estate before becoming a Buddhist temple. People still regard it as a privilege to be allowed to assist in gardening such a sacred place. Miniature hills and an occasional green island would become one of Japan's major contributions to garden design. Katsura is an imperial villa begun in 1620, the same year the Pilgrims went ashore at Plymouth. The garden is so designed that the water is never out of the visitor's view as he walks around. Along the shore, each smooth sea rock has been individually selected for color and size, somehow summing up the exquisite attention to detail the Japanese have lavished on their gardens over the centuries. Katsura superbly expresses the Japanese attitude towards nature. The aristocrats who built it had a profound respect for it, and they knew how to endow perfected nature with their own human emotions. They also knew how to deftly integrate the architecture into the landscape. It is this genius that has somehow healed the age-old separation between man and his environment, while all around allowing the textures to express themselves in the close-up intimacy of winding paths and secluded retreats. The Japanese gardener knew that less was more 400 years before it became a design slogan of the 20th century. Another passionate lover of nature, the Dutch painter Mondrian, disciplined his feelings into severe abstract shapes. So the Japanese garden architects give an austere refinement to their gardens. Garden refinement reaches its ultimate state of otherworldly abstraction in the Zen garden. This austere Buddhist sect first appeared in Japan in the 12th century and was quickly taken up by a jaded aristocracy. The ancient Zen garden of Japan is solely for contemplation. Only the gardener, raking the fine white stones, ever actually steps into it. Ryoanji is the supreme Zen garden made of only 15 mysterious stones and raked gravel. But in a space the size of a tennis court, an entire philosophy is held within its earthen walls. All ages come here to meditate in an environment that has radically reduced all distractions. The spirit of simplicity and subtle understatement has always informed traditional Japanese art. This spirit of aesthetic restraint is expressed in garden design as a part of the ritual of the tea ceremony. But it couldn't be further from a sociable English tea party. The so-called tea garden is simply the garden path by which you enter the ritual of the ceremony itself. It is the place of a transition and initiation into the solitude of another world and prepares the guest to achieve serene detachment from everyday affairs. A solemn formal ritual, the tea ceremony is without any religious significance, but it is a deeply spiritual occasion nevertheless. It represents a break in the day's routine that provides a moment of repose, a time of quiet, pleasurable reflection. The garden serves to condition the visitor's mind to the right emotional and spiritual state. History and tradition, with its powerful conservative grip on the slow evolution of the Japanese garden over the centuries, has not discouraged the creation of this largest public park and botanical center to be built since the Second World War here at Osaka. It is built on the site of the city's old garbage dump, and during its construction, methane gas torches, like so many fireflies, dotted the newly planted hillside. Money, technology, and vision quickly brought about the transformation. If the 20th century is a disruptive note to this garden setting, still there are layers of meaning and pleasure to be found in the flowers and plants brought here from all over the world. The Japanese garden, as a man-made environment, was meant to be seen, felt, and enjoyed. Contemplation is in the mind of the beholder.